June 5, 1944, 23:45 hours. The western coast of France lay draped in an uneasy silence, the Channel winds carrying the smell of brine and oil. Above, the night sky was fractured by the occasional shimmer of lightning, yet for the German outposts scattered across Normandy, nothing unusual stirred. Searchlights swept methodically, radar stations hummed, their beams reaching across the Black Sea like invisible spears, probing for the enemy fleet that they knew would come, and yet those beams struck nothing. The screens inside the bunkers glowed with emptiness. To the German operators, the Channel appeared eerily vacant, as though the sea itself had withdrawn. Bundesarchiv, Fond 62 Würzburg diary fragment, June 1944. But in reality, the water churned with the most massive armada in history. Thousands of ships moved forward in silence, their hulls cloaked by storm and deception. From above, Allied bombers thundered in formation. The German eyes in the dark, the vaunted radar stations of the Luftwaffe, were blind. Entire sectors flickered with false echoes, phantom squadrons conjured on command. Real planes vanished from the scope, swallowed by ghostly silence. Panic rose in voices along the coast. Reports contradicted each other, interceptions scrambled to empty skies, and commanders barked orders at shadows. U.S. Army After Action Report, June 1944. Inside the bunker at Douvres, a radar officer leaned forward, sweat dripping beneath his headset. The scope pulsed faintly, then dissolved into chaos, blotches of static that bloomed across the screen like fire-consuming paper. He adjusted dials, recalibrated, swore under his breath. Somewhere in the storm beyond the coastline, an Allied fleet should have been visible. Instead, the machine's glass eye revealed only confusion. "It is impossible," one technician muttered, his voice trembling. Dramatized composite. The machines do not lie. But the machines had already been deceived. In the distance, the first murmurs of thunder were not weather, but artillery warming to life. German night fighters scrambled from fields near Caen, their Daimler-Benz engines screaming against the dark. Pilots strained their eyes for silhouettes, for the flicker of exhaust flames, but the radio chatter erupted with dismay. Keine Sicht, keine Sicht. No sighting, they were chasing ghosts. Coordinates fed from screens poisoned with illusions. Luftwaffe intercept log, June 1944. The silence broke like glass. Allied aircraft streaked across the night, unseen until the roar of engines vibrated the bunkers. Bombs tore craters into radar stations along the coast, muzzle flashes igniting the cliffs. But to the men inside, the attack felt uncanny. Why had there been no warning? Why had the radar betrayed them? As concrete shattered and flames lit the sky, a realization spread like a sickness among the defenders. Something was wrong on a scale they could not understand. For the men stationed at Pointe du Hoc, the horizon itself seemed cursed. German spotters reported convoys that vanished before their eyes, shimmering fleets that dissolved into nothingness. Others reported no fleet at all, only an empty channel, until within hours the sea boiled with landing craft. The German officers at their command posts clutched telephones and barked into radios that returned only static. Orders to the Luftwaffe went astray. Squadrons flew in circles above empty waters, their fuel wasting while the true invasion fleet moved inexorably toward Normandy. British Admiralty Report, June 1944. The confusion was total. At Cherbourg, an operator stared at a phantom echo on his screen, convinced an Allied convoy was moving north. Reports flooded up the chain, fleets moving in opposite directions, formations multiplying like a hydra. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, whose defensive genius had prepared Normandy's walls of steel, was not even present. He had left to visit his wife for her birthday. In his absence, his subordinates were confronted with an enemy they could not see nor fight. Their radar, the eyes of their defenses, had gone dark at the moment of decision. For the men of the Wehrmacht on the cliffs, the invasion began not with sight but with sound, the low, rolling thunder of Allied naval guns that seemed to rise out of nowhere, the endless drone of planes passing unseen overhead. When the sky lit up, it was already too late. Columns of smoke clawed upward, fires leapt along the ridges, and the channel turned into a mirror of flame. German soldiers who had once laughed at Allied clumsiness now trembled in disbelief. The enemy had arrived with overwhelming force, and yet they had been invisible until the storm broke. And still, no one understood why. In the reports scribbled hastily that night, there are traces of fear disguised as logic. Interference from storm activity, one report guessed. Massive coordinated jamming, another suggested. But the truth was something far more insidious, something the Germans could not yet imagine. The Allies had mastered a weapon not of steel or fire, but of the invisible spectrum. A weapon that turned the Luftwaffe's sharpest eyes into blind glass. U.S. Strategic Deception Memo, June 1944. In the days that followed, survivors from the first night of Normandy whispered among themselves, haunted by what they had seen or failed to see. Radar operators swore that entire fleets appeared out of nowhere. Pilots described pursuing bomber formations that dissolved like mist. Some believed their instruments had failed. Others muttered about sabotage, betrayal from within. But the truth was more chilling. The Allies had reached into the very airwaves, twisting reality itself. The defenders of Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been blinded, not by darkness or fog, but by a new art of war, an invisible war fought in frequencies and echoes. The night of June 5th to June 6th was more than the prelude to D-Day. It was the birth of a terrifying new reality. Machines, once trusted as infallible, could be deceived, manipulated, even turned against their masters. For the German defenders, it was as though the laws of war had shifted beneath their feet, and as the first Allied boots struck sand at Omaha and Utah, the question lingered in every German bunker: if radar, their shield, their sentinel, could no longer be trusted, then what hope did they have of stopping the tide? The echoes of that night would not fade. To the men who survived, the memory was one of blindness, of fighting shadows in the dark, while the real enemy struck with precision. The invasion had not only breached their walls, but shattered their confidence in the very tools meant to guard them. In those desperate hours, panic spread faster than gunfire. A weapon had been used that was unseen, intangible, but devastating, and its secret would remain hidden from the Germans long after the beaches were lost. And so, in the smoke-filled dawn of June 6, as Allied forces stormed ashore, one truth burned into the minds of the defenders. They had not merely been overwhelmed, they had been deceived, blinded by a weapon they could not comprehend, a weapon that had turned the tide of war before the first soldier even fired his rifle. The story of how the Americans and their allies blinded the Luftwaffe over Normandy was only beginning to be written. The secret of that night lay buried in laboratories, guarded by engineers and signals officers, whispered only in code. To the Germans, it remained a mystery. To history, it would become one of the great hidden victories of the Second World War. And to the men standing on the sands of Normandy, it was the difference between life and annihilation. The question that now loomed was simple, yet terrifying. What had the Allies discovered? What invisible power had they harnessed that could turn the mighty Luftwaffe into helpless prey in the skies over France? Summer, 1944. Europe lay in ruins, yet the war was far from decided. For nearly 5 years, the German Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe had dominated the continent with speed, coordination and terror. Blitzkrieg had torn through Poland, France, and the Low Countries. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had dictated the skies over Europe. But as the tide of war shifted, a new reality was emerging, one that would come to its climax on the beaches of Normandy. By early 1944, Adolf Hitler's fortress Europe was tightening its grip. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, a vast web of bunkers, mines, artillery, and barbed wire. It was sold to the German people as an impenetrable barrier, a wall of fire and steel that no invader could breach. To command it, Hitler entrusted Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had earned his reputation in North Africa. Rommel understood the vulnerability of the coast. He warned repeatedly that if the Allies established a foothold, Germany could not push them back. His solution was brutal but logical: crush the invasion at the waterline, annihilate the attackers before they could secure ground. Rommel report to O.B. West, March 1944. Opposing him were the combined might of the Allies. By mid-1944, the United States had poured its industrial heart into the war machine. Over 12 million Americans wore uniforms. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh and Chicago churned out tanks, aircraft and weapons at a scale never seen before. Britain, though battered by years of war, stood resilient. Its radar network and Royal Air Force seasoned from the Battle of Britain. Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations pledged men and machines. And the Soviet Union, though not present at Normandy, tied down hundreds of German divisions in the east, bleeding Hitler's armies white. The scale of preparation for Operation Overlord was staggering. Nearly 156,000 troops were assigned for the first wave alone. They would cross the channel aboard 5,000 landing craft, escorted by over 200 warships, and supported by 11,000 aircraft. It was not just a battle of soldiers, it was a test of doctrines. The German doctrine emphasized static defense, relying on fortifications and local counterattacks. The Allies favored mobility, deception, and overwhelming firepower. Nowhere would these competing visions clash more violently than in Normandy. Sheshaf Planning Records, April 1944. The Germans believed their advantage lay in preparation. Along the coast, the Luftwaffe's radar network served as the nervous system of the Atlantic Wall. The Würzburg and Freya radar systems could detect aircraft over 100 kilometers away. Linked to command posts and flak batteries, they promised early warning and rapid response. In theory, any Allied fleet or bomber formation would be spotted long before reaching the beaches. German night fighters, guided by radar vectors, could intercept intruders with deadly precision. This system had proven devastating in earlier years, claiming thousands of Allied bombers during the night raids over the Ruhr. Luftwaffe Radar Operations Manual, 1943. But the war was changing faster than the Germans could adapt. Allied intelligence, led by Britain's codebreakers at Bletchley Park, had unraveled much of the German communication system. Decryption of Enigma messages revealed not only troop movements, but also weaknesses in German radar coverage. At the same time, scientists and engineers in Britain and the United States were experimenting with countermeasures, ways to confuse, deceive, or completely blind enemy radar. The Germans assumed their machines were infallible. The Allies knew better. On paper, the Luftwaffe still looked formidable in 1944. Over 2,000 aircraft were assigned to defend Western Europe. Yet reality told another story. Shortages of fuel, lack of experienced pilots, and the overwhelming industrial power of the Allies had eroded its strength. The Americans alone could replace lost planes at a rate the Germans could only dream of. For every Me-109 fighter produced in Germany, Detroit rolled out multiple Pa-51 Mustangs and Pa-47 Thunderbolts. For every German radar destroyed, Allied engineers developed new tactics to suppress or deceive it. U.S. War Production Board Report 1944. Still, the German commanders clung to their doctrine. Convoy interception strategies assumed radar would provide sufficient warning to mass their limited resources. Luftwaffe control centers relied on precise radar vectors to guide night fighters into bomber streams. Without radar, their entire air defense system collapsed into chaos. And yet, unknown to them, this collapse was exactly what the Allies had engineered. The battle for Normandy was not merely a clash of armies. It was a duel of minds between German confidence in machinery and Allied innovation in deception. British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had perfected Window, the code name for strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft. These created false echoes on radar, appearing as ghostly bomber formations. American engineers developed jamming devices, code-named Carpet and Mandrel, which emitted radio noise to blind enemy receivers. Together, these tools formed a hidden arsenal, a secret war waged in the invisible spectrum. Technical Manual TM-11's 235, 1944. To the average soldier, these weapons were unknown. Men dug into foxholes or climbing into landing craft had no idea that their lives might depend on a signal bouncing through the air. But for the planners at SAF headquarters, radar deception was as crucial as tanks or rifles. If the Luftwaffe could not see the invasion fleet until it was too late, Allied troops stood a chance of surviving the deadly gauntlet of the beaches. If the German coastal batteries were blinded, the Armada could close in, and if the Luftwaffe was drawn away by phantom formations, the real skies over Normandy could be secured. The historical context was one of desperate timing. Hitler's Reich was under pressure from all sides. In the east, the Soviets prepared their massive summer offensive. In Italy, the Allies were grinding their way north toward Rome. And in the west, a deception campaign codenamed Operation Fortitude convinced the Germans that the invasion would fall at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Rommel and his staff shifted resources, uncertain and misled. But even if they had guessed correctly, even if every division had been in place, the question remained, how could they defend a coast if their very eyes were stolen? For the Allies, Normandy was the ultimate gamble. The success of D-Day depended not just on bravery but on invisibility. The Germans expected to see a vast fleet long before it reached their shores. Instead, they would see nothing. Or worse, see everything at once. Phantom fleets blooming across their screens, each demanding attention, none revealing the truth. The Luftwaffe, once the predator, was about to become prey. And as June 1944 arrived, with the Channel winds carrying fleets of men and machines, the Allies prepared to unleash their hidden advantage. In bunkers and command posts, German officers sharpened their pencils, awaiting the familiar pulses on their radar screens. What they would see, and fail to see, would decide the fate of Europe. The cliffhanger was set. The Atlantic Wall stood tall. The Luftwaffe's radar eyes glowed with confidence, and Hitler's generals waited for the storm. What they did not know was that the storm had already come, and they were already blind. The storm that struck Normandy in June 1944 did not come from the sea or sky alone. It came from an invisible domain the Germans had underestimated, a domain of waves, pulses, and frequencies that could be bent, twisted, and erased. The hidden advantage was not a tank, a plane, or a gun. It was silence. Silence on a screen where alarms should have rung. Silence in the headphones of radar operators who strained to hear the echo of wings. Silence that masked the most massive amphibious landing in history. The Germans had long trusted their radar network as their shield. The Freya system, with its tall lattice antennas, could detect formations of aircraft over 100 miles away. The Würzburg radar, a dish-shaped marvel of German engineering, guided flak guns with eerie precision, allowing gunners to strike bombers at night as though they were shooting by daylight. In the early years of the war, these systems had been the terror of RAF Bomber Command. Crews spoke of the uncanny way German searchlights found them, how flak batteries tracked them with impossible accuracy. Radar was the unseen hunter, the force multiplier that allowed the Luftwaffe to defend Fortress Europe even as its fighter strength dwindled. Luftwaffe Technical Briefing, 1942. But in 1943 and 1944, British and American scientists quietly reversed the equation. They discovered that the hunter could be blinded. At laboratories like the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, and at American bases in New Jersey, physicists, engineers, and radio operators experimented with waves of their own. They built devices that spat noise across the spectrum, drowning radar receivers in a storm of static. They perfected window-thin strips of aluminum foil cut to half the wavelength of enemy radar beams, dropped in clouds from bombers. Window created thousands of false echoes, each strip bouncing radar waves back like a phantom plane. German operators would watch their screens blossom with hundreds of targets, each indistinguishable from the real. Technical Manual TM 11-235, 1944. To the Allies, this was not merely technology. It was deception elevated to art. In the same way that generals had once deployed cavalry feints or wooden cannons, now they deployed radio waves and aluminum chaff. A single squadron could appear as an entire fleet. An invasion force could vanish into static. The Luftwaffe's vaunted eyes could be tricked into seeing what the Allies wanted them to see, and nothing more. The Germans could not comprehend it. For years, they had believed radar to be an absolute advantage, a scientific miracle immune to trickery. They imagined their enemies stumbling in the dark, while their own beams painted clear pictures of the night sky. But by 1944, the illusion had turned. German crews at Normandy found themselves staring at empty scopes while bombers roared overhead, or scrambling fighters toward phantom formations that dissolved into the void. Dramatized composite. The screen is lying to us, one operator confessed. It shows shadows. I cannot tell what is real anymore. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots scrambled at midnight, climbing into the dark skies, burning fuel and nerves, only to find nothing. Commanders issued frantic orders to intercept fleets that did not exist. And when the real invasion came, the warning time collapsed from hours to minutes. By the time the true fleet was visible, by the time searchlights caught the silhouettes of ships and the drone of engines filled the sky, the beaches were already under assault. U.S. Army After Action Report, June 1944. It was not just jamming or chaff. Entire operations were built upon radar deception. In the days leading to D-Day, the Allies launched Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable. Small groups of aircraft dropped endless streams of window off the French coast, simulating invasion fleets heading toward Pas-de-Calais. Radar operators reported armadas where none existed, pulling German reinforcements away from Normandy. Meanwhile, other aircraft broadcast false radio traffic, mimicking landing craft communications. To the German defenders, the entire channel seemed alive with invaders. They had no way to separate truth from illusion. British Admiralty Deception Report, June 1944. The hidden advantage was not merely technological. It was philosophical. The Allies had embraced flexibility, improvisation, and the marriage of science with strategy. Generals listened to physicists. Admirals trusted engineers. In contrast, the German High Command dismissed warnings, underfunded countermeasures, and clung to faith in their machines. They assumed superiority by default. The Allies, humbler and hungrier, sought every edge. They found one in radar deception. Imagine the view from a bunker on the night of June 5th. An operator peers into the green glow of a scope. At first, the line is clean. Then, suddenly, the screen blooms with signals. 100, perhaps 1,000 echoes move steadily toward Calais. Reports are sent up the chain. Field commanders curse and call for reinforcements. Hours later, another operator reports silence in his sector, yet minutes after, explosions rock his coast as the real fleet lands. The confusion is not incidental. It is engineered. It is victory without a shot fired. The kind of victory invisible to soldiers but decisive for armies. For the Luftwaffe, the humiliation was unbearable. Once they had been the predator, descending from the clouds with impunity. Now over Normandy, they stumbled in blindness. Pilots who once trusted vectors from the ground now cursed them as false. The radar system that had once given them mastery of Europe now betrayed them at the critical hour. Even as brave men fought and died in trenches and tanks, the outcome was already influenced by signals no eye could see. This was the hidden advantage of the Allies, the power to make the enemy question his own reality. The German soldier, the German pilot, the German officer all looked to their instruments, their screens, their trusted machines. And in that moment of need, the machines lied. The trust shattered, confidence withered. The Atlantic Wall, so formidable in concrete and steel, had been undermined in silence. In the cold logic of war, it was a revolution. No longer was victory determined solely by the clash of armies or the range of guns. It could be decided in the ether, in signals, in the invisible war of deception. At Normandy, the Allies proved that blinding the enemy was as powerful as destroying him. And once blinded, the Luftwaffe could not strike, could not defend, could not win. The Germans never truly understood what had happened that night. To them it was chaos, bad luck, perhaps even betrayal. They guessed at jamming, cursed the weather, blamed overloaded equipment, but the truth remained hidden, locked in Allied secrecy, guarded by silence. The hidden advantage had worked too well, leaving only confusion in its wake. And so, as dawn broke over Normandy, the German commanders faced a nightmare they could not explain. Their radar had failed them. Their Luftwaffe had stumbled into blindness. Their wall had been breached. And in that failure lay the beginning of the end. The question remained how, precisely, had the Allies achieved such mastery of the invisible? What machines, what inventions, what factories and scientists had forged this secret weapon? Beneath the thunder of guns and the clash of armies, there existed another battlefield, a battlefield built of circuits, vacuum tubes, and invisible pulses racing through the ether. To understand how the Luftwaffe was blinded over Normandy, one must step into the world of frequencies and machines, where engineers and physicists fought with equations instead of rifles, and victory meant altering what the enemy could see, or making him see nothing at all. German radar in 1944 was considered state-of-the-art. The Freya radar system, with its towering antenna arrays, operated at 125 MHz and had a maximum detection range of nearly 120 kilometers. It could pick up incoming bomber formations long before they reached the coastline, giving German defenses time to scramble fighters and prepare flak batteries. Complementing it was the Würzburg radar, a smaller dish-shaped system operating at 560 MHz. Unlike Freya's wide sweeps, Würzburg offered precise tracking, able to follow a single target with accuracy within 0.2 degrees. Together these systems formed the backbone of German air defense. Once Freya spotted intruders, Würzburg would lock on and direct anti-aircraft guns with deadly precision. Luftwaffe Technical Manual FUM G62, 1943. The Allies knew they could not storm Fortress Europe without neutralizing these electronic eyes. Bombing raids against radar sites helped, but they were costly and temporary. What was needed was something subtler, more insidious, a way to deceive the machines themselves. Enter Window. Developed by British physicists in 1942, Window consisted of thin strips of aluminum foil cut to exactly half the wavelength of German radar. Each strip, when dropped from an aircraft, reflected radar pulses back to the receiver, creating a false echo, identical to a real aircraft. A single bomber dropping a cloud of Window could appear as a squadron. A squadron could appear as an armada. RAF Technical Memorandum 1943. The beauty of Window lay in its simplicity. Bundles of foil strips were ejected at regular intervals, cascading down like metallic snow. On radar screens, operators suddenly saw entire bomber streams where none existed. During the first mass use in the Hamburg raids of 1943, German defenses were paralyzed. Over 791 bombers dropped 92 million strips of Window, creating radar images so overwhelming that anti-aircraft guns fired blindly, and night fighters floundered in empty skies. The lesson was clear: radar could be blinded not just by force but by trickery. By Normandy, the Allies refined this into surgical deception. Aircraft like the Lancaster and B-24 carried special chutes that dispensed Window at precise intervals, simulating the radar profile of a moving fleet. Two deception operations, Glimmer and Taxable, used just a handful of planes to create the illusion of massive invasion forces sailing toward Calais. The German radar screens bloomed with echoes, convincing commanders that the true invasion was not at Normandy at all. British Admiralty Report, June 1944. But foil alone was not enough. To truly blind the Luftwaffe, the Allies deployed electronic warfare devices that spewed noise into the radar bands. American B-24 Liberators were fitted with carpet jammers, designed to overwhelm German radar receivers with random static. Flying in orbits near the coast, these bombers blanketed Würzburg and Freya stations in electronic snow, erasing real signals. The British contributed with Mandrel, a wideband jammer that projected powerful noise across the 100–300 MHz range, effectively shutting down Freya radars. At the same time, Jostle, a massive 2000-watt jammer mounted on B-17 SES, disrupted German VHF radio communications, filling the airwaves with howling interference. Technical Manual TM-9294, 1944. These machines were crude by modern standards, but devastating in their effect. Vacuum tubes glowed inside heavy, box-like transmitters. Antennas protruded awkwardly from fuselages. The operators, often radio technicians reassigned from civilian posts, manually tuned dials, hunting for the frequency that would cripple enemy screens. It was as much art as science, requiring instinct, precision, and nerves of steel. The German response lagged fatally. Engineers at Telefunken and Siemens had begun experimenting with anti-jamming filters, but production delays and Hitler's obsession with offensive wonder weapons left defenses neglected. A handful of modified radars attempted to adjust frequencies mid-operation, but Allied intelligence anticipated these shifts. Jamming aircraft carried tunable transmitters, sweeping across bands to follow the Germans wherever they fled. It was a technological cat-and-mouse game, but by June 1944 the mouse had become a predator. Meanwhile, the Allies built vast factories to produce these electronic weapons. In Detroit, where tanks and jeeps rolled off assembly lines, subcontractors churned out chaff bundles by the millions. At RCA and General Electric, technicians mass-produced vacuum tube jammers. Britain's telecommunications research establishment employed thousands of scientists, mathematicians, and even stage magicians to refine radar trickery. What had once been a handful of experimental gadgets was now an industrialized arsenal. U.S. War Production Board Report, 1944. Numbers told the story starkly. A single carpet jammer could disrupt Wurzburg radar over a radius of 30 kilometers. A mandrel-equipped aircraft could blind an entire sector of Freya stations. Window clouds, properly deployed, could multiply the apparent size of an Allied bomber stream tenfold. When combined, these tools produced chaos. Static storms, phantom fleets, and silent skies where real aircraft moved unseen. The Luftwaffe's operators were not fools. Many suspected deliberate deception. Reports described bewildered crews scribbling notes as their scopes bloomed with impossible targets. Some tried to filter the noise manually, adjusting gain controls and narrowing beams. Others simply gave up, reporting that their equipment had failed. Dramatized composite. "We are fighting ghosts," one officer muttered after hours of fruitless tracking. "The machines no longer serve us, they betray us." For the men storming the beaches, none of this was visible. They knew only the roar of engines, the crash of shells, the cold steel of landing ramps slamming open. Yet their survival was tied to these invisible machines. Every radar blinded by carpet, every phantom fleet conjured by window meant fewer German guns aimed at the true invasion force. Every minute of confusion bought by mandrel gave another soldier a chance to reach sand instead of dying in the surf. The technical war over Normandy was not glamorous. It lacked the heroism of charging infantry or dueling tanks. But it was decisive. Without radar deception, the Luftwaffe might have massed fighters to slaughter the invasion fleet. Without jamming, the coastal batteries could have fired with deadly accuracy. Instead, the defenders floundered, blind and deaf, their confidence shattered. The machines they trusted had been turned into weapons against them. It was a lesson written not in explosions but in silence. A silence engineered in laboratories, tested in secret flights, and unleashed in the greatest gamble of the war. In that silence, the Atlantic wall cracked, and on the morning of June 6, as German radar stations burned and Allied troops clawed their way inland, the invisible war had already been won. The Luftwaffe's blindness was not an accident. It was the deliberate triumph of science, production, and deception working hand in hand. Yet the true test of these weapons was still to come. The first major battle where radar deception turned chaos into victory. June 6, 1944, 4:30 hours. The first light of dawn crept over the English Channel, but the waters were already alive with steel and thunder. More than 5,000 vessels churned forward, their wakes stitching white scars across the sea. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway, and yet on the screens of the Luftwaffe radar operators, much of this armada did not exist. What appeared instead were phantom fleets to the north, shimmering across the scopes like ghost convoys. The real invasion was masked by a fog of deception, and the German defenses were about to feel the cost of blindness. At Cap Grisnez, Freya radar operators stared in disbelief as their scopes bloomed with echoes suggesting a massive Allied fleet steaming toward Pas-de-Calais. Orders raced up the chain of command. Interceptors scrambled from bases in Belgium and northern France, banking their wings eastward toward a battle that did not exist. Hours later, their fuel tanks would run dry over empty seas. The real fleet, carrying 156,000 men toward Normandy, advanced unopposed. Bondisarchiv Freya Station Log, June 1944. By 5:10, the first wave of Allied landing craft approached Utah Beach. A curtain of naval artillery roared overhead, shells streaking across the horizon to hammer German fortifications. On shore, Wehrmacht defenders scrambled to their positions. Machine gun nests scanned the surf, bunkers locked their sights, and coastal batteries awaited targeting data from radar stations. But the screens showed chaos. Static hissed, ghost fleets lingered on scopes. Real targets vanished entirely. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the sky, their crews cursing their instruments as Allied bombers swooped in from unexpected angles. Technical Manual TM9 294, 1944. At Omaha Beach, the situation was even more desperate. The German 352nd Infantry Division, dug into fortified positions, awaited precise coordinates from Würzburg radar to guide their heavy guns. Yet those coordinates never arrived. Carpet jammers orbiting offshore blasted Würzburg frequencies with noise, smothering signals in white storms. Commanders shouted into radios drowned in static. Fire control collapsed into guesswork. German gunners fired by eye and instinct, but their salvos fell wide. Meanwhile, Allied destroyers closed to within a mile of shore, their guns tearing into pillboxes with surgical precision. The Luftwaffe attempted to respond. At 6:15, a squadron of U-88 night fighters scrambled from Caen to intercept what they believed was a bomber formation approaching Normandy. The intelligence came from radar echoes conjured by window. Foil strips dropped from a handful of British bombers flying deceptive patterns. The German pilots climbed through the morning mist, scanning the skies, their fuel gauges ticking downward. But the formation dissolved into nothing. When they turned back, the invasion fleet was already hammering the beaches. Dramatized composite. One pilot reportedly spat into his mask, "We are chasing shadows. The machines betray us." On Juno and Gold beaches, the Canadian and British landings benefited from Operation Glimmer. A small group of aircraft, flying parallel tracks, dropped endless streams of window to simulate invasion fleets heading toward Calais. German radar operators tracked these phantom fleets with urgency, convinced they were the true threat. Reinforcements destined for Normandy were delayed as commanders hesitated, unwilling to strip Calais of defenders. The deception worked perfectly. Hours were lost, and in an invasion measured in minutes, those hours were fatal. British Admiralty Deception Report, June 1944. By mid-morning, Allied control of the skies was nearly absolute. Over 11,000 aircraft supported the invasion, strafing convoys, bombing strongpoints, and cutting off reinforcements. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties across the entire day. Many were misdirected by radar confusion. Others never found their targets. Of the handful of German aircraft that reached the beaches, most were driven off by swarms of P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires patrolling overhead. For German soldiers crouched in bunkers, staring at the skies they once owned, the silence of their own air force was deafening. U.S. Army Air Force Combat Report, June 1944. The scale of destruction on the ground was immense. At Point du Hoc, U.S. Rangers scaled sheer cliffs under withering fire. Their survival owed partly to the radar deception that delayed German artillery coordination. At Sword Beach, British tanks rolled ashore under a canopy of smoke, advancing through chaos as Luftwaffe aircraft failed to appear in force. Casualty figures were staggering: over 10,000 Allied men killed, wounded, or missing on D-Day alone, but they could have been far worse. German defenses, deprived of radar guidance, fought blind. In one bunker near Caen, a surviving radar operator later recounted how his screen went black minutes before the invasion began. He twisted dials, checked cables, pounded the console in frustration. When he finally stepped outside, he saw the horizon ablaze with ships and aircraft. "They were already here," he muttered, stunned. "We saw nothing until it was too late." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. By the evening of June 6, the beaches of Normandy were secured. The Atlantic Wall, proclaimed impregnable, lay shattered. Thousands of Allied troops pushed inland, establishing a foothold that would grow into a tide. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been reduced to impotence. The reason lay not only in bravery or numbers, but in the silence engineered across the spectrum. Radar deception had stolen the eyes of the defenders, leaving them to fight ghosts while the real invasion swept ashore. The battle was more than flesh and steel. It was the first large-scale demonstration that technology could alter the very perception of reality in war. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated in the air that day. It had been defeated in the ether, in the invisible war of signals. The German commanders, reeling from the day's events, could not yet comprehend how thoroughly they had been deceived. They saw only failure, chaos, and betrayal by the very machines they trusted. D-Day would be remembered for the heroism of soldiers storming the beaches, for the sacrifice and blood spilled on sand and surf. But behind every charge, every shot fired, there was another story, the story of silence and deception, the story of radar blinded and air power paralyzed. It was a battle fought with foil strips and static storms, a battle that tipped the balance of the greatest invasion in history. And as the smoke cleared over Normandy, one truth was undeniable. Without radar deception, D-Day might have been a massacre. With it, the Allies had secured their foothold in Europe. The question now turned to the aftermath. What impact did this invisible victory have on the course of the war, and on the minds of those who lived it? The beaches of Normandy were stained with blood. But by the evening of June 6, they were firmly in Allied hands. From that moment onward, the war in Western Europe began to move inexorably toward Berlin. Yet for the German defenders, the memory of that day carried not only the weight of defeat but a peculiar sense of betrayal. They had not simply been outnumbered or outgunned, they had been blinded. Their machines, which they trusted with absolute faith, had failed them. And the psychological fracture this caused was as devastating as the physical losses on the battlefield. In the weeks following D-Day, interrogations of captured German officers revealed an undercurrent of disbelief. Some insisted that their radar had malfunctioned. Others swore sabotage had occurred. Many could not accept that the Allies had deliberately deceived their systems. Dramatized composite. It was as if the sea itself conspired against us, one Luftwaffe officer muttered in captivity. We saw phantoms where no enemy existed, and when the enemy came we saw nothing. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Strategically, the impact was profound. The Luftwaffe had entered 1944 already weakened. Fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, and relentless Allied bombing of aircraft factories had eroded its strength. But the radar network had been its last great equalizer. With radar guidance, even a diminished Luftwaffe could mount ambushes, coordinate flak batteries, and bleed the Allies in the skies. By stripping away that advantage, radar deception reduced the Luftwaffe to a reactive force, stumbling in the dark. On June 6 alone, the Germans launched fewer than 300 sorties across the entire invasion front. In contrast, the Allies unleashed over 11,000. U.S. Army Air Force Operations Report, June 1944. The psychological gulf widened in the days that followed. Allied troops, despite suffering horrific casualties, advanced inland with growing confidence. Their commanders knew that the radar deception had worked. The Luftwaffe was no longer the omnipresent predator it had once been. German soldiers, meanwhile, muttered of betrayal by their technology. Many refused to trust radar plots at all, relying instead on direct observation, an impossible task in an age when war moved faster than the human eye. The loss of faith spread through the German command structure. At Hitler's headquarters, reports from Normandy contradicted one another so violently that the Führer himself delayed mobilizing armored reserves. He believed, based on phantom echoes from Window, that Normandy was a feint, and the true invasion would come at Calais. His obsession with this illusion held panzer divisions in reserve for critical hours, allowing the Allies to expand their beachhead. Nara Hitler Situation Conference notes, June 1944. This paralysis, born from deception, rippled outward. Rommel, returning hastily from his leave, found the Atlantic wall shattered. His carefully laid defenses had been breached in hours. He knew the truth. Without accurate radar, the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht could not coordinate. The wall had become a hollow shell. His despair is evident in his later statements. Dramatized composite. It was not the strength of the enemy alone, he confessed to staff. It was our blindness. We fought with our eyes closed. On the Allied side, morale soared. Stories circulated quickly of German confusion. Fighters circling empty skies, artillery firing blind, radar stations abandoned or destroyed without resistance. For soldiers who had faced the full weight of German might in North Africa and Italy, it was a revelation. The enemy was still dangerous, but he was no longer infallible. Radar deception had leveled the playing field. The strategic impact extended far beyond Normandy. The success of jamming and chaff emboldened Allied planners to integrate electronic warfare into every campaign. As the push toward Paris and the Rhine began, bombers carried jammers on nearly every mission. Window became routine, confusing flak batteries from France to the Ruhr. German radar operators, once the most feared guardians of the night sky, now hesitated at every echo. Was it a real formation, or a phantom? Each hesitation cost lives. Each moment of doubt eroded efficiency. Rogue Signals Warfare Report, 1944. Psychologically, the Luftwaffe's decline accelerated. Pilots who once trusted ground control now relied only on their own eyes, a fatal handicap against Allied fighters with superior numbers and range. Radar crews, demoralized by constant jamming, reported equipment useless and unreliable. Confidence collapsed. The aura of technological superiority that had carried Germany through the early war years evaporated in the face of Allied innovation. To the average German soldier, the loss of radar's reliability felt like abandonment. They had been promised an Atlantic wall that could not be breached. They had been told their technology gave them supremacy, yet in the crucible of Normandy, that promise shattered. The defenders were left to fight blindly against an enemy who seemed to appear from nowhere, striking with precision. Fear spread, not only of Allied firepower, but of Allied trickery, of an unseen hand manipulating the very fabric of battle. The Allies, in contrast, understood the deeper significance. D-Day proved that technology was no longer merely a tool of war, it was the battlefield itself. The mastery of radar deception was as critical as the mastery of tanks, guns, and men. It signaled a new era, where wars would be decided not just by courage or numbers but by control of the invisible spectrum. For the Germans, the psychological wound was permanent. Even when radar managed to function in later battles, doubt lingered. Operators second-guessed their instruments. Commanders hesitated. Pilots cursed the false vectors. The bond of trust between man and machine was broken. In war, that bond is everything. Once shattered, it cannot be fully restored. And so, the strategic and psychological impact of radar deception at Normandy was immense. It did not merely blind the Luftwaffe for a day, it crippled its ability to act with confidence for the remainder of the war. It sowed confusion at the highest levels of German command. It robbed the defenders of faith in their technology, and it gave the Allies a new weapon, an invisible one, that multiplied their strength. The beaches of Normandy were won with blood and steel, but they were also won with silence and shadows, and in that silence, the Luftwaffe lost more than its radar. It lost its certainty, its confidence, and its claim to dominance. The war was not yet over. The Reich still had divisions, tanks, and fanatical resolve, but the balance had shifted irreversibly. Radar deception had cracked the Atlantic wall and pierced the myth of German invincibility. What remained was to consider its legacy not only for the rest of the war but for the wars yet to come. When the echoes of D-Day faded, the legacy of radar deception endured far beyond the beaches of Normandy. What had begun as desperate improvisation, foil strips tumbling through the sky, crude jamming boxes wired into bomber fuselages, became a blueprint for modern warfare. The Germans never fully understood how they had been blinded, but the Allies, in their laboratories and after-action reports, knew they had opened a door to a new kind of battlefield, one where victory would not depend solely on who had the most tanks, the strongest fortifications, or the bravest soldiers, but on who controlled the invisible spectrum of signals and silence. In the months after June 1944, the Allies pressed their advantage. Every bomber raid into Germany carried window blanketing the night sky with metallic snow that rendered radar plots meaningless. Jamming devices, once experimental, were installed as standard kit. Carpet, mandrel, and jostle became as essential to the war effort as bombs and fuel. Luftwaffe crews, once confident in their ability to vector night fighters with pinpoint accuracy, were reduced to blind guesses and frantic improvisation. The German air defense network, built on precision and discipline, collapsed into chaos. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The psychological toll was lasting. For years, the Luftwaffe had terrified Allied bomber crews with radar-directed ambushes. By 1945, the roles were reversed. German defenders no longer trusted their own instruments. Reports filled with doubt, hesitation, and resignation. Pilots were launched into empty skies. Flak batteries fired at shadows. The machines that had once made them predators had become unreliable guides, and in war, uncertainty is as deadly as enemy fire. The strategic consequences rippled across the remainder of the campaign. In Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy in July 1944, radar deception again masked bomber formations. During the liberation of Paris, German commanders hesitated to redeploy reserves, fearing phantom invasions conjured by window. Even in the Ardennes, during Hitler's last gamble in December 1944, Allied electronic warfare blunted German reconnaissance, ensuring their surprise was partial, never complete. The lesson of Normandy, that deception could blind, confuse, and paralyze an enemy, was never forgotten. When the war ended in 1945, Allied investigators pored over German radar logs, diaries, and after-action reports. They discovered the depth of confusion that had gripped the defenders. Many entries mention mystery echoes, static storms, and phantom fleets. Few guessed at the true cause. To the Germans, it remained a mystery wrapped in misfortune. To the Allies, it was proof that science and deception could win battles as decisively as bullets. Bundesarchiv radar logs, 1944. The legacy did not end with the surrender of Germany. In the Cold War that followed, radar deception became doctrine. American and Soviet forces invested heavily in electronic warfare. Bombers carried not just bombs but pods bristling with jammers. Fighter squadrons trained to drop chaff corridors, carving ghost pathways through radar networks. Naval task forces blanketed themselves in electronic fog, hiding fleets of carriers from enemy eyes. What had begun on the night of June 5, 1944, became a permanent feature of global conflict. The Gulf War of 1991 bore the fingerprints of Normandy's lessons. Coalition aircraft blinded Iraqi radars with modern descendants of Window and Mandrel, jamming their frequencies and dropping chaff corridors that simulated phantom fleets. Pilots spoke of watching enemy radar-guided missiles veer harmlessly toward decoys. Generals described command networks paralyzed by false signals. It was Normandy, replayed with modern machines, proof that the invisible war still decided battles. For veterans, the memory of Normandy's silence lingered. Soldiers remembered the skies strangely empty of Luftwaffe aircraft, the guns firing erratically, the enemy reacting too late. Families of radar operators recalled the haunted looks of men who insisted the machines had betrayed them. Historians traced the moment when German confidence cracked, not in the trenches or the fields, but in the bunkers where screens glowed with lies. The moral was stark. Technology, no matter how advanced, is only as strong as its ability to resist deception. The Luftwaffe learned too late that their sharpest eyes could be blinded by tinfoil and static. The Allies learned that innovation, secrecy, and imagination could level the field against even the most formidable defenses. The lesson echoed into every military academy: control the spectrum, and you control the battle. Even today, the story of Normandy's invisible war carries a warning. In an age of satellites, drones, and cyber warfare, the temptation to trust machines blindly is ever greater. But the ghosts of June 6 whisper otherwise. Trust can be turned. Screens can lie. The most powerful weapon is not always the largest gun, but the ability to shape what the enemy sees and what he believes. In the end, the Germans never knew the full truth. They never grasped how American jammers, British window, and Allied coordination had blinded their mighty Luftwaffe. They only knew that on the day it mattered most, their vision failed. Their confidence collapsed, and their Atlantic wall, once hailed as unbreakable, crumbled before an enemy that was not only stronger, but cleverer. As one American general would later remark, reflecting on the silence that covered the beaches that day, in modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor. And in Normandy it was deception, silent, invisible, unstoppable, that turned the tide of the Second World War.